different ways. And I think this is a very useful and important discussion to have. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's my general impression that critical scholars tend to talk more about critical theory than actually critical methodology. And I think we need to bring both on the table as we're doing within this workshop. And so I also therefore really appreciate that we had this focus today. My approach will be slightly programmatic, and I will not talk about my own research. Just like Ola Söderström this morning was talking about the concerns about what's happening with social science in general, and also what Mert is going through now in Turkey. I think this is very important to talk about the role of academia in general. But in particular, I want to focus on the politics of methodology and the possibilities of decolonializing methodologies, and also using that not only within post-colonial studies, maybe, but also in a broader sense in the urban studies field, because I think there's a lot we can learn from decolonizing methodologies. Okay. So I think when we talk about the politics of methodology, it concerns several different aspects. And the first one we have been talking about quite a lot is about the sort of power relations between different positions, globally positions, like the global centers and the peripheries, where some places are meant to be or often used as the tier of information, the spaces from where tier of information are made, and the other ones are used as empirical examples. And this is something we've been talking about quite a lot in these sessions. But I also think it's important to talk about the relation between science and social sciences, because this is also some kind of colonization going on here by science of social science, which often appears in forms of new public management. It can influence, for example, where and how we can publish, and how social science is being evaluated. And then science is very much becoming a norm for how social science also should work. And the third, I think, is also about why do we do research? And I think this is a question we maybe have to ask ourselves sometimes. More and more, it seems like research is done with the aim to score high rankings, to get points, but less importance of actually making change in society. To be aware of the politics of methodology, I think it means to keep in mind some questions like, how do we delimit our research? Where do we start from? The positioning of our research? Which questions are being asked? Who do we talk to? Who are our partners in research? And how do we give back to our research to our society? This means that we also have to realize the importance of our situatedness in academia and academic history. We need to be aware about the power relations, and in some places this is about the privileges we have that have formed our knowledge, and also what we regard as relevant and how we can do things differently. And science has played a crucial role in colonizing as well. So I mean, we often carry critical history with us in our work, in our academic environments. I also think it's very important to think about the research design. When we formulate a research design, we are often confronted with several practical issues, and during 2020, of course, several of us were confronted with the COVID. All of us were confronted with the COVID situation and how to deal with that in our research. And it's also through research design we can challenge not only our colleagues but also ourselves to broaden our perspectives. Another point I want to bring up is the importance of what we call ethics, because while ethics and severe considerations and care for the ones that we do research with are important, academia is increasingly bureaucratized and sometimes with very contradictory policies. Like we're being introduced to the idea of both open access data, that we should all have our data very available, but also to the work with anonymity. So there's a lot of these things that which often doesn't come from science, and how this affects what we can do and how we organize our work. And I think this takes a lot of time as well to consider all these responsibilities that we tend to be given, while at the same time the sort of ethical concerns, which is for critical scholars, should also be why we're focusing on the uses of research, and also the questions what we are asking, what kind of questions are we actually asking? So I think there is a lot of more to the aspects of ethics than just sort of conforming the bureaucracy of it. It's about why we're doing research and how we are doing research and how it can be used or not used. The last thing I wanted to bring up on this point is the importance of research dissemination and language. And much academic work is becoming increasingly idiosyncratic, I tend to think. Are we only talking to ourselves? So what is the relevance of the research we're doing? And we need a common language to communicate, and that common language is often English. While at the same time, I think it's very important to all be aware of our native languages, because there's often a much larger reach out and possibilities to make change if we also can communicate within our own language, which is not often so much valued in the work that we are doing in the rankings we are all confronted of. But I don't think it's only a matter of what kind of language, but also the conceptual relevance. What are the relevances of the concepts we are using? And for whom are we developing these concepts? In what way are they actually helping us to see beyond what we already know? So how is language used, and the power of language, I think, is something to be quite aware of, to be working on decolonizing methodologies. Feminist and post-colonial scholars are, of course, very much aware of this, that methods are not neutral. And I take this quote by Linda Tuhi-Vai-Smith, who's been writing on this topic. And I think she formulates this very nicely when she talks about the methodologies and methods of research, the theories that inform them, the questions which they generate, and the writing styles they employ, all become significant acts which needs to be considered carefully and critically before being applied. In other words, they need to be decolonized. But to decolonize maybe not all it means to erase or reinforce divides, can also be aware about all research situatedness. And she also writes, decolonization, however, does not mean and has not meant a total rejection of all theory or research of Western knowledge. Rather, it's about centering our indigenous concerns and worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our indigenous own perspectives and our indigenous own purposes. And this also means to be aware that just like the South is not the common denominator, so is not the East, the West, the North either. So while we're focusing on methodologies, of course, important for how we conduct the research, it also aims for theory formation. But theories are always contextual and can never be static, as society is constantly changing. And this is why it is important to develop theory through empirical work in different contexts, as we have been talking about. And this often challenges the idea of ground theories, which is still a lively debate within critical studies, not least through a feminist and post-colonial critique. However, regardless of how scholars relate to ground theories, I want to encourage especially younger scholars to have a healthy disrespect for authorities, as we're all situated somewhere, both in space and in time, and there's a limit to individual knowledge. I think that's important to keep in mind. And here I want to bring in some feminist methodologies, which I think is very useful for this discussion as well. And I think it has inspired several of the contributors to this workshop. And because this has mainly been my entry point to decolonize the methodologies. And I think this sort of embodied this sort of healthy disrespect for authorities. And I think, for example, remembering Iris Marion Young's work from the 1990s, early 1990s, when she conceived the idea of the philosophical bandita, a feminist bandit who selectively steals resources where she's that she finds useful, but then of course also leave behind what other work she finds sexist or unhelpful. Or the work by Sarah Ahmed, the feminist Killjoy, or which I think is very inspiring, the work by Brenda Parker, where she talks about the feminist partial political economy of place, which is sort of pointing at the partial aspects lies in the fact that solutions and analyses cannot be copied from one place to another, but at the same time, we must be able to go beyond each particular context to be able to trace similar patterns and structures, like neoliberal capitalism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, racism, shape urban life in similar ways, but in different settings and in different contexts also changing this situation with particular variations. So power relations are repeated in multiple elsewheres, which also calls for this comparative approach that we have been discussing. And finally, I just want to leave you with another classic work by Audre Lorde, who in 1984, I think it was, formulated the idea of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think I will leave you with this quote, but I think this really calls for that we also need to look forward, but also maybe learn from the previous work that has been done within feminist and post-colonial theory, and learning to develop these tools. And this is what we're gonna do this afternoon, this Friday afternoon. So thank you. That was my introduction to the topic of today.